A new municipal ID card for Milwaukee residents, a law that would knock chewing tobacco out of the ballpark, and the city lays down a plan to start replacing lead laterals that supply water to older houses. This is Council Rewind, and I'm Dustin Weiss. Whether it's signing up for a bank account, checking out books at the library, or interacting with police, you've more than likely needed to pull your ID out of your wallet recently. For most folks, that means a driver's license, but not everyone drives, and other folks can have a harder time finding the documentation they need to obtain a state ID. Not to mention it can be tough to find the time and transportation to visit the DMV. So Milwaukee has decided to join a growing number of cities nationwide in issuing residents a municipal ID card that can be used to obtain basic services. And on November 7th, the plan went before the Licenses Committee.
And this is the fun, and this is the exciting part, and this is where I want to give a thank you to the folks at the Public Information Division, particularly Ms. Laura Vanderbilt, who designed this, and we have the card. This is the Milwaukee Municipal ID. Obviously, the photograph will not be the black silhouette, but will be someone's face. Will be someone's face, and the identity will be there. The thing that this does not show is the raised pressed image of the city seal that will appear at center when the card is laminated. When the card is laminated, you will be able to feel it. It'll be the city seal. We've done a special die just for that purpose, and that's DIE, not DYE. And so you'll be able to feel that right as you press that down. Also, please notice at the bottom in a font that is 12 points on the card itself, not for voting purposes. That is the exact language required by the statute that governs this. It will be recalled that certainly Alderman Rainey will recall most vividly that Milwaukee County attempted to do this. They were then forbidden to do so by the state of Wisconsin for their own reasons. They chose to let cities continue to do it, so we've taken this opportunity. But one of the things that they did indeed require is that language, as you see it, appear in a particular sized font, and so we have done so. And if you could just show them the back real quick, Andrew. This is what the back will look like. It, in compliance with the city charter, includes the city mark. We have left the top back open, and that was deliberate. That is the space which we could potentially place a magnetic strip, if indeed we could broaden this out. I know that there's great interest on the Common Council to encourage Milwaukee County to accept this, and other agencies as well, and to create a sort of a unified MKE ID approach.
What will the strip be used for?
Well, if you're familiar with identification, Magno strips can be used for any number of data sets you could put on there. For example, your library card has a magnetic strip on there that has ID, and any magnetic strip can, and they're like almost like a little floppy disk. You can just put data on them, and the question is what the system reads. It's our hope, and I stress hope, and one of the things I'll be asking council members to do once we get past our launch is to really reach out to the community and get this accepted as a form of ID, both in the private sector, banks, drugstores, grocery stores, all sorts of other places. And as by the way of a brief digression, I think there's been a chicken and egg problem with getting municipal ID accepted. We would go to people, we would talk to them and say, well, what would we need to put on an ID to get it acceptable to you? And they say, well, you don't have an ID, so we can't tell you. So now we can show them this, we can show them our process and say, is this acceptable to you? And if it's not, why not? What can we improve? And so as we work forward in this and as we evolve this thing, it is our sincere hope that it could include any number of things. And it's certainly a down the road sort of a thing. It's a long-term conversation, but it could be your library card. It could be your medical identification, just ID, not obviously information. But it could be any number of things that would let people use one card more efficiently as part of being a portion of this broader Milwaukee community.
What's the difference for this card versus the state of Wisconsin ID card in terms of the paperwork that has to be provided?
I think when you compare the two, they're similar. We actually patterned a lot of this after that. This is Also, we're looking for something different than they're looking for. I remember in one of the community meetings that I attended, a gentleman that was there was sincerely disappointed that he couldn't use it to drive. But, and even though this card is clearly marked that it cannot be used for identification, certainly we want to have an ongoing conversation about its validity, and hopefully we'll see that there isn't a great deal between them. There are certain things that we take that they don't, that, you know, and things of that sort, tiny variances, but they're actually pretty close.
So, I mean, you know, we want to get at a population so that doesn't have IDs, that do have IDs. How is this making things easier to get an ID versus the state of Wisconsin ID?
I think at the threshold level, we do accept certain things that the state doesn't take. There are certain things, and also we are working very aggressively to allow homeless persons, those who are temporarily or permanently homeless, to be able to at least identify themselves, if not their residence.
So it's a little bit easier to get documentation that's acceptable to get this card versus the state of Wisconsin ID
Yes.
card. Okay.
Yes, and we are also working with them, and we're also working more aggressively, I think, we're working more aggressively with those communities to get them identified.
When victims, need to seek shelter, often shelters do require and are asking for identifications of families. So that's always been a very critical thing for the people that we've served. To be able to also present an ID when victims are in the hospitals. We often have to respond, and when victims are in the emergency rooms, or we take victims to the emergency rooms, and they ask for identification, they ask for insurance, so often they don't have anything to show. The other issue, too, is to be able to help victims access their police reports. We often have to take our victims to get to the police department so that they can get their police reports, so that we can be able to help them with their victims' crime compensation, and ultimately help them with their Violence Against Women Act immigration process. That is critical, that we need to have that supporting documentation.
And so my husband's pickup truck looked like the truck that had been involved in the hit and run, and so he was stopped and questioned by police.
Y pidieron una identificación a mi esposo y también la mía.
So they asked identification of both of us.
Yo di una identificación que no estaba vigente y mi esposo la matrícula, una identificación de otro estado, de México, perdón.
So my husband presented the Mexican consulate ID, and I presented a Wisconsin ID, but it was expired.
Y nos tuvieron mucho tiempo detenidos ahí porque no nos podían identificar bien. Y no daban la razón por qué nos estaban deteniendo. No sabíamos el por qué nos tenían ahí detenidos.
And we were detained there for a very long time. We weren't given the reason why we were being detained, and part of the problem was also just the identification we were presenting.
The City of Milwaukee's ID will be the first to feature recognition of transgender persons in a meaningful way, acknowledging that we are more than what others expect us to be. During this campaign, we've heard testimony from a trans woman about how she had been pulled over by a police officer in a routine stop and subsequently fingerprinted on her way home from work. She had committed no crime, no action that was of threat to anyone, except that she possessed an ID that was not who she is to herself, to her family, to her coworkers, and even to the officer who had pulled her over and was compelled by law to judge her based on that ID. The interaction took over an hour, and it was for time that could have been spent meaningfully.
I came to Milwaukee in 1990. My mother was a victim of domestic violence, and we were homeless. And in 1990-91, I believe we had some type of identification that was similar to the municipal ID. When you are literally running for your life, you don't think about packing up your identification, birth certificates, and things like that. Plus, my mother didn't drive, so she didn't have a driver license in the state of Illinois. And when we got here, she was able to obtain a Milwaukee County ID, and that really helped us to provide us and get us some of the benefits we needed as far as safety net, stamps, housing, things like that. But until she became aware such identification was available to her, and and she felt comfortable and safe to do such, we were homeless. We were living in a car, and she didn't have any identification. It was hard for her to get me enrolled in school and things like that. So I know we look at municipal ID through the lens of immigration we heard about and through LGBT rights, but I want us also to take in consideration from domestic violence and homeless people, because this is a huge issue for our city, for our county, and our state.
I was one of the original authors of this policy as a county supervisor, and it was my hope that we can actually use this as an opportunity to generate some excitement about our cultural amenities. So if we could take this local ID and we can include our library membership, our Milwaukee Art Museum, our public museum memberships, all of our cultural assets and other offerings in the city of Milwaukee all in one card, I think that'll be very exciting to the people of Milwaukee. So possibly there is still an opportunity for collaboration between the city of Milwaukee and the county.
There are a number of people in this community who need access to municipal forms of identification, as evidenced by the speakers who testified here today. In my district, I've got a very large population, I believe the largest Hmong population in the city of Milwaukee, and this ID, the ability to access it, provides a unique opportunity for that group of people as well, in addition to the folks and the community folks mentioned earlier who need that sort of access.
With the approval of the council, the city clerk's office will begin issuing municipal ID cards by year's end. In a big league effort to combat cancer, Milwaukee is poised to join a handful of cities nationwide that have banned chewing tobacco in local ballparks. The effort is intended to address the mixed messages that pro ball players send to kids when they dip on the field, and on November 10th, a local ordinance went before the Public Safety Committee.
I was originally contacted by individuals from the American Lung Association, community advocates, and Cancer-Free Society for Children. And they expressed strong support of putting in legislation that would eliminate the role models that children look up to as ball players at Miller Park. As you may have noticed in the World Series in Chicago, you didn't see anyone chewing tobacco. They were either chewing bubble gum or sunflower seeds, because in Chicago it bans the use of smokeless tobacco. The argument is that kids emulate ball players in terms they look up to them as role models, and when they see them chewing tobacco on the ball field, they use that as an example. Well, maybe that's pretty cool and something I like to do, and they enter into the arena of smoking, or in this case, chewing. It is well-established fact that chewing tobacco is a known carcinogen. It is as deadly as smoking tobacco. Whether it's oral cancer or tongue cancer, the ramifications are quite serious. Originally, the legislation was looking at just to target Miller Park. And unfortunately, in going through the legislation, working with the city attorney's office, it really wasn't practical. You can't just target one specific limited boundary of an area. We are a city of a whole, and it has to be a uniform action. So at ball fields throughout the city, you wouldn't be able to chew tobacco. Now, the issue of penalty provision, there is a penalty provision in it, like there is for smoking cigarettes. It's between $100 and $250. But in the legislation, individuals do get a warning before a ticket is issued. So if somebody is chewing tobacco, somebody is asked to stop chewing. As we well know, when the legislation went nationally and went statewide for smoking cigarettes, it's self-policing. There's very little police time that's used in being by officers issuing citations to individuals who are smoking in bars or anything like that. It's really a self-policing action.
15% of all high school males use smokeless tobacco because they want to keep their body healthy, so they say they don't want to inhale smoke. 535,000 teens between 12 and 17 use smokeless tobacco for the first time each year.
What's that number again?
535,000 kids in the United States between 12 and 17 use smokeless tobacco for the first time. It's so subtle, because the impression of teens is that, and particularly those who are athletes, is that I'm not hurting my body because I'm not inhaling smoke. That's why it's hideous, it's insidious that they use that. And I think that it's hard for me to sit here and say that I wish that we couldn't have had this type of ordinance, which has been sponsored and drafted by Alderman Murphy 5, 6, 7 years ago. Yes, I would have liked to have seen it, but the climate wasn't there. It would have been dead on arrival, and it still may be. I hope that's not the case. But so that's why you haven't heard me say that, but you certainly have heard my advocacy for a smoke-free Milwaukee and smoke-free Wisconsin.
Our campaign to knock tobacco out of the park is gaining momentum. As you've heard, 6 major league cities have already passed similar proposals. D.C. just passed it. Mayor will sign it, we hope, within the next week or so. So we're on the verge of a tipping point where the league and the Players Association will have to agree to do something that would have seemed impossible just a few short years ago, to eliminate the use of tobacco in all games throughout the league. Milwaukee, with the leadership of Alderman Murphy and the entire Common Council, is poised to help make that happen. With your help, we can achieve the goal before the start of next year's baseball season, providing this protection for our kids from an industry that is not beneath using their heroes to get them addicted is long overdue. This ordinance is about health and the future of our children.
How were you so successful in reducing regular cigarettes in young people, but not this smokeless tobacco?
In some ways, especially because we're talking about the athletes, the most amazing statistic I've seen is that among high school, even as we've reduced smoking among high school students and high school athletes, among athletes it's even lower. It's like 4%, 3 or 4% of high school athletes smoke. They recognize that it's horrible for them. They would never consider harming their body. But for smokeless tobacco, it's higher than average. And the only explanation, or the real explanation, is when they see the single largest influential body, Major League Baseball players, because that's the highest rate in high school is ball players, the association is, well, that's, they don't see baseball players smoking in the dugout anymore or anywhere really. They don't see it. It's become deglamorized, denormalized. But chewing is not.
Well, it would seem to me that Major League Baseball could ban it themselves if they want to.
The players have to agree. The Players Association has to agree, and they have not agreed.
Well, you got some work to do with them then, I guess.
We've been working on it. I mean, that's been the issue, but we've sort of told them if they're not going to agree to it, and perhaps the union is representing their small minority, but their chunk of people who are still chewing, we said this is the right thing to do, whether you'll agree to it or not, so we will go through other routes, and that's how we've got now. Beginning of next season, more than 1/3 of Major League stadiums will be tobacco-free, and we'd love to have Milwaukee added to that and have more. The one thing last thing I'd like to point out, our research department hasn't confirmed me to use this, but I like to point out, for over 100 years, the Cubs did not have a World Series. What was different this year? They banned chewing tobacco. They won. You draw the conclusion. I'm just saying.
We do look up to these baseball players, and if we see that they're healthy and they're able to get and be as successful as they are, and they're able to chew tobacco, then that gives us the mindset that we can do the same thing and be just as healthy. But that's not true. That's not the right facts. And something needs to be done so that we're not inheriting this bad habit.
I also had a son who spent several years in Little League. He's in his mid-20s now. But I remember that the first thing we had to do anytime he had a game was to go to the concession stand. And more often than not, this is what he chose. He chose, I want a package of Big League Chew.
Yeah.
Which is bubble gum. Bubble gum made to look like smokeless tobacco. You can see the packaging on it. You can see what the substance actually looked like. And more often than not, that's what he wanted, for the same reason that the grandmother over said there, dear, because that made him a real baseball player.
I always believe that the argument for the best argument against cigarettes was the secondhand smoke argument. That people near you are smelling that and the impact that that might have on people who simply don't want to be around that or be impacted in a negative way. So I don't think that this is the case with smokeless tobacco. I do have some concerns about the impact it would have on adults who make that choice for whatever reason. I do have concerns, quite frankly, about government, in a sense, overreaching. I would much prefer a movement that the Major League Baseball would take on and ban it themselves, as opposed to government once again intervening in this issue. Having said that, I am going to support it.
Thank you.
The smokeless tobacco ballpark ban passed on a 14-1 vote. Thousands of older homes in Milwaukee and nationwide get their water service from lead lateral pipes. While the water is treated to prevent lead from leaching into the water and poisoning residents, the city is looking at long-term solutions to replace those laterals altogether. The catch is that, legally, the city only owns half the lateral, and the homeowner is responsible for the other half. So while lawmakers explore ideas to address the problem citywide, on November 14th, the Finance and Personnel Committee heard legislation that would lay the groundwork, so to speak.
The Milwaukee Water Works would be responsible for the entire cost of the utility-owned service line. The administration is proposing a 2/3, 1/3 split on the privately owned portion, up to a maximum of $1,600 for the private property owner. The private property owner would pay that through a special assessment that we propose, and this will come, the length of time change will come through a separate piece of legislation, but could be paid over 10 years. The substitute ordinance in front of you or before you also includes provisions for non-compliance with the replacement mandate, which include fines of $100 a day for a maximum of 16 days, as well as eventual discontinuation of water service to non-compliant properties.
Okay, so how are we determining the zones or the neighborhoods, or is it by amount or the age of the home? How are we making that determination between the leaks?
Well, again, this is a situation where there's really no predictability involved here. We're going to encounter a leak that happens wherever it's very unforeseen. It's an emergency situation, and then we'll basically what happens, people report water surfacing in a certain location. We investigate and we determine it's a service leak, and then we address it. So there's no telling where it's going to happen.
Okay. So the age of the house is not a factor?
I mean, there's probably anecdotal correlation between the two. If the older the house, the older the service, the more likely that it's gonna. But there's no formula or there's no predictability equation that we can use to tell you exactly where we're gonna be.
During the emergency leak, how many houses are actually affected? And in those houses being affected, how many houses are mandated during that emergency leak?
So we're talking about emergency as it pertains to a service line, not a water main. In water main, that's a totally different scenario. So typically, if you have a leak on a service line, the only impacted property is the property that's being served by that particular service line. Okay, so that's when we actually shut it off at the main or at the curb stop, and then fix the leak, and then the only person or resident that would know is the resident that is served by that service.
Okay. So when a main is leaking, when does the mandate apply?
There's no mandate at this point, because what we're doing in the case of a water main break is we're going in and fixing the actual water main. In the future, when we're actually under a program where we're replacing the water main and we know that the services on the main are lead services, those will be proactively managed, and then all the property owners will know that we're coming, and there'll be a more structured process in terms of alerting them, putting them on notice, and working through all the logistics in terms of how we're gonna coordinate the not only replacing our piece, but as well as theirs.
So for 2017, $3.6 million to get us 300 leaks and 385 daycares. Okay.
That's the plan.
And then next year you have a $5 million goal of 1,400 properties. Is that right?
When you say next year, do you mean 2018?
I mean 2018.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. That's what I mean when I say next year.
Right, that's a preliminary projection, but
Okay.
that could then be incorporated as part of the main replacement effort.
Okay.
And a
So
plan
talk about
for
the workforce development piece. When does that start, and how are you going to implement that?
Well,
Get individuals trained and working.
Unfortunately, I don't have any plan to present you with, in any meaningful way. We know that it's a commitment that we made to this committee, to the council, as well as to the mayor, that we will develop a workforce development that makes sense, right? So we've been talking to the people who are going to partner with us in terms of, end up with a productive program. And I'm talking about the plumbers union, the contracting communities, because we need a buy-in. We need their ideas as to what that thing looks like. So unfortunately, I can't give you any details because I don't have them at this point.
Have you started yet?
The conversation, yes. We haven't started work.
What is the average cost to a homeowner that they will face?
In this case, $1,700.
Well, excuse me.
I'm sorry, go
No,
ahead.
we're capping it at $1,600,
$1,600,
and that's a preliminary. I mean, the $1,600 is hard. It's the lesser of 2/3 or $1,600. We've been basing our projections up to now on a $5,000 typical cost. I think there'll be variability based on the type of lot and frontage, but I've seen some, I think, that have been done for perhaps as low as $3,700 that we've been engaged in. So that would then put it, 1/3 of that would be about $1,200. But payable over 10 years.
In the case that we would essentially shut off the water services, what are the processes in place to ensure that the property owner would then comply? Because I'm thinking that if they don't care whether or not there's water service there, then they may just let the property, just let it go. And then we're left with a zombie property, in a sense. So what processes are in place to kind of help prevent that?
Well, that's why the options available include not just discontinuation of service, but also the penalty and also the prospect of a court-ordered hookup and enforcement.
Okay. Okay.
Certainly trying to.
And certainly, the water utility is a regulated utility, and complaints can be filed with the Public Service Commission of Wisconsin. I mean, we're regulated.
The 5 entities that were so generous as to give about $90,000 to purchase filters for vulnerable populations in the city. Those filters have been delivered and distribution has started. So we've got 2 partners in that effort. One is the Social Development Commission. The other is 16th Street Health Center.
Okay.
And those will be the points of distribution for those. We've also gone to assess and actually reassess all the tenants in city-owned properties and find out which are vulnerable populations. They'll have a filter delivered to them. The Housing Authority is working on a similar process for their Section 8 clients. So as those Section 8 clients come in, they'll assess vulnerable populations, make sure that they live in a house with a lead service line, which is obviously the first box to check, and then we go through, children under 6, nursing or pregnant women, and other vulnerable populations. And in those cases, then those are folks that we would give a filter to. And the council, of course, passed an amendment to the mayor's budget that the administration certainly supports, adding, I believe, $150,000 for additional filter purchases. So we're just going to keep growing that distribution. And I think the more help we can get from the community and from yourselves in getting the word out about that, the better.
The plan was held in council so members could more closely examine the financial impact on homeowners. And that's a look back at some of the important issues from the most recent Common Council cycle. For the City Channel and Council Rewind, I'm Dustin Weiss.